My name is Sonia. I'm 30. I used to be a staff sergeant working logistics in the U.S. Army. For 4 years, I chewed on those dry, tasteless MREs and slept in barracks where the heat didn't work and the air bit your skin. I sent every single penny of my hazard pay back home because I thought my family was drowning. But the day I finally took off that uniform and stood outside my own kitchen, I heard a truth that killed every bit of faith I had left. My 35-year-old brother had just set $890,000 on fire trading crypto. He's in deep with the wrong people. And my mother, holding a bone china teacup like she was royalty, told my father, "Make Sonia hand over that farm so Garrett can sell it. She's just out there playing in the dirt anyway. She's a woman. She doesn't need that much money." I gripped the edge of the door until my knuckles were white as bone. They think a soldier just shuts up and does what they're told. They forgot that logistics is about knowing how to cut the enemy's throat by cutting their supplies. To see how I left them with nothing but their own shame, you have to look at the day they put a price on my life, a cruel, cold number. Tell me where you're listening from in the comments. Like and subscribe if your own blood has ever tried to bury you, and you want to see me take back every cent they stole. May 2018. New York City. The air in Soho was thick with the smell of expensive cologne and ambition. We were at Balthazar, a place where the bread is crusty and the lighting is designed to make everyone look like they belong to the 1%. My father, Douglas, sat at the head of the table, his chest puffed out as if he were the king of Manhattan. Garrett sat in the middle, wearing a smirk that cost more than my entire year's salary. The bill for that night alone was $680. As the waiter cleared the plates, Douglas reached into his blazer and pulled out a heavy set of keys. He slapped them onto the white linen tablecloth with a sound that felt like a gavel. "Upper East Side," my father announced, his voice booming over the chatter of the restaurant. "Paid in full, $847,000, and another $15,000 for the furniture, so you don't have to sit on the floor like a bum." Garrett laughed, his eyes gleaming with the arrogance of a man who has never had to earn a thing. I sat at the edge of the table, my back straight, my hands folded perfectly in my lap. I felt a thick, hot lump of steak caught in my throat, but I forced it down. I was 22, home on a short break, and I had just transferred $500 of my own pay into my mother's savings account that morning. My mother, Vivian, leaned over. Her fingernails were painted a sharp, predatory red as she squeezed my shoulder. The wool of my sweater was cheap and scratchy compared to her silk scarf. "Your turn will come, honey," she whispered, her voice like honey poured over glass. "Whenever you're ready." I believed her. I actually believed her. I reached into my pocket and touched the crinkled receipt for that $500 transfer, thinking I was part of a team. Thinking we were building something together. May 2021. 3 years later. The scenery changed. The Soho lights were replaced by a flickering neon sign for a strip mall in a town that felt like it was dying. I wasn't at Balthazar. I was sitting in a ripped vinyl booth at an Applebee's, the air smelling of old fryer grease and floor cleaner. I was wearing my formal uniform, the fabric heavy and stiff, every crease pressed to a razor edge. My graduation ceremony had lasted 3 hours. I stood on that stage, looking out into a sea of families, searching for 3 faces that never showed up. The chair across from me was empty. No wine, no steak, no keys. The bill sat on the sticky table, $86. My phone buzzed. It was a notification from the family group chat. Garrett had sent a message, 12 words, cold, final. "Congrats on the degree. Now go find a real job and stay busy." That was it. That was the reward for the years I spent in frozen rooms, the nights I spent eating noodles out of a cup in a dirt hole so my brother could have the best of everything. My family had turned into ghosts the moment I had something to celebrate. "Hey, Sonia." I looked up. Natalie, a girl I had known since we were kids, stood there in her faded cashier's apron. She had dark circles under her eyes from working the night shift, but she was smiling. She slid a small, cheaply wrapped box across the table. "I know it's not much," she said, her voice soft. "But you did it. You're the only one who actually made it out of this town." I opened it. A pair of silver earrings. Simple. $40. I knew Natalie's life. I knew she had to stand on her feet for 8 hours to afford those. As I gripped the cold metal of the earrings, the edges dug into my palm. It was a sharp, physical reminder of a brutal truth. Love isn't a feeling. It's a transaction. To my parents, I was a bad investment. I was the help. I was the person who moved the boxes and sent the checks. But I was never meant to sit at the head of the table. I stood up, my movements precise and controlled. I paid my $86 bill, tipped Natalie $20, and walked out into the rain. My phone rang. The caller ID showed my father's name. I answered. Hello? Sonia. Douglas's voice was gruff, devoid of any warmth. Get your stuff together and come home this weekend. I have a gift for you. It's time we settled up. I looked at the silver earrings in my hand and then at the dark, wet road ahead. A gift. After giving Garrett $1 million life, they had a gift for the daughter who had given them everything. I didn't say a word. I just got into my truck and started the engine. The game was finally changing, and they had no idea I was no longer playing by their rules. 3 days after I walked across that stage in an empty hall, I was summoned back to the house. The air in my father's living room felt heavy, thick with the scent of expensive suede and the oaky bite of the scotch Douglas had been nursing since noon. My father sat on his custom-made sofa, the one that cost more than my first 3 years of work combined. He didn't look up when I walked in. He just kept his eyes glued to the Wall Street Journal, the pages snapping sharply as he turned them. I sat down in the armchair opposite him. I didn't lean back. My spine was a rod of steel, keeping me exactly 2 inches from the cushion. It was a habit I couldn't break. Staying ready, staying alert. Across the room, my mother, Vivian, was busy with a crystal nail file. The rhythmic scritch, scritch, scritch was the only sound in the room. She didn't look at me either. To them, I was just a piece of furniture that had finally moved. Douglas finally closed his paper and set it on the glass coffee table. The sound of the paper hitting the surface was like a final verdict. Without a word, he reached for a yellow manila envelope and slid it toward me. Your graduation present, he said, his voice as dry as a desert floor. I picked it up. Inside was a deed for 12 acres of land in the Hudson Valley. My heart didn't jump. I knew my father. I looked at the appraisal attached to the back. The land was valued at $198,000. The house on it, $0. At the bottom, highlighted in a cruel neon green, was the annual property tax bill, $4,200. I looked at the top corner of the deed. A small yellow sticky note was crookedly attached. In my father's cramped, jagged handwriting, it read, Bad soil. House about to collapse. I looked up, my face a mask of nothing. 3 years ago, you gave Garrett $15,000 just for a sofa and a new TV, I said, my voice flat, holding no vibration. I asked you for $2,000 last month to fix the main line here. You told me to find a second job. Douglas didn't even blink. He reached for his scotch and took a slow, deliberate sip. Garrett's apartment in the city is an investment, Sonia. It's about optics. It's about status. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing with a cold sort of pity. That place in Hudson, well, at least, there you can't really break anything important. The gap was $664,000. That was the price difference between my brother's life and mine. To my father, I was a liability. I was a person who should be grateful for the scraps thrown under the table. Vivian finally looked up from her nails, her smile as thin as a razor blade. She didn't say a word, she just went back to her filing. I stood up, the yellow envelope clutched in my hand. I didn't scream, I didn't cry. I walked out of that house and drove 3 hours north. It was June, but the Hudson Valley didn't feel like summer. By the time I reached the property, the sun was a bruised purple on the horizon. The house was a skeleton of wood and rotting shingles. When I pushed the front door open, the hinges groaned like a dying animal. The air inside hit me first, stale, heavy with dust, and the sharp, ammonia sting of rat droppings. I walked straight to the kitchen. I needed to see if I could at least wash the grime of that living room trial off my skin. I found the water heater in a cramped closet and flipped the breaker. A second later, a scream of metal ripped through the silence. A loud hiss followed, and then a thick, black sludge began to pour from the rusted pipes. I checked the shutoff valve. It was seized solid. The repair estimate on my phone from a local plumber popped up a few minutes later. $1,850. I sat on the floor of that kitchen, the only light coming from my phone screen. I opened my banking app. Balance, $4,392. The tax bill was due in 30 days. $4,200. If I fixed the water, I wouldn't have enough to pay the taxes. If I didn't pay the taxes, the state would take the land before I could even plant a seed. I had exactly $192 to my name if I wanted to keep this roof over my head. My father hadn't given me a farm. He had given me a financial execution. The temperature outside began to drop fast. By midnight, it hit 38 degrees. The house had no insulation, just the cold breath of the mountains leaking through the cracks in the walls. I stripped off my clothes in the dark, standing in the middle of that ruined kitchen. I took a gallon jug of water I had brought with me, water that was now as cold as the night air, and poured it over my head. The shock was so violent, it felt like a physical blow. My muscles locked up instantly. My teeth wanted to chatter, but I clamped my jaw shut so hard my head ached. I stood there, the water dripping off my skin and onto the dirty floorboards, and I refused to shiver. I thought about Garrett's $15,000 sofa. I thought about the $680 dinner in Soho. I thought about my father's gift. I'm standing here in the dark, with nothing but a debt I didn't ask for and a family that wants to see me fail. Have you ever been handed a gift that was actually a curse? Have you ever had your own parents treat you like a second-class citizen? Comment curse if you felt that sting and hit that like button to show me I'm not standing in this cold alone. I need to know you're with me before I take the next step. I reached out and turned the flashlight on my phone off. The darkness was absolute. I leaned my head against the cold, damp wood of the kitchen counter. My father thought I couldn't break anything important here. He was right. Because from this moment on, the only thing left to break was them. I didn't sleep that night. I just waited for the sun to rise so I could start digging. I had $192 and a shovel. It was more than enough to start a war. The screen of my laptop flickered, the white light burning into my retinas like a slow-moving fever. It was 2 a.m. I was sitting at the kitchen table of my rotting house, staring at endless rows of inventory data. $18 an hour. That was the price of my dignity these days. I needed that $4,200 for the property taxes, and I needed it before the state put a lock on my gate. My father hadn't just given me a house, he'd given me a clock that was ticking toward my own funeral. By day, I was in the dirt. By night, I was a ghost in the machine, typing until my fingers went numb. I tried the farmer's market first. 4 hours standing under a bruising July sun, trying to sell heirloom tomatoes that looked like art but sold like scrap. At the end of the day, after gas and fees, my profit was exactly $18. My palms were a mess of yellow blisters and raw skin. I was staring at a bruised beefsteak tomato when a shadow fell across my table. "Your soil is too heavy in clay," a voice said, sharp. "No nonsense." I looked up. Dr. Amelia Brennan stood there, wearing a sun hat and looking at my produce like it was a crime scene. She picked up a tomato, rubbing the dark earth still clinging to the skin between her thumb and forefinger. "You're wasting your time with these," she said, tossing the tomato back. "This land wants something that survives on neglect. It wants lavender." She didn't offer pity. She offered a map. A test run would cost $4,090 for the starters and the irrigation. I didn't have it. My family certainly wouldn't give it. 2 days later, Natalie sat across from me in my drafty kitchen. She reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope. Inside was $3,200, mostly in 20s and 50s. It was her entire savings from the checkout counter. "No interest," she said, pushing a piece of notebook paper toward me. "Just sign this so we're official." I signed that handwritten note with a shaking hand. My own mother wouldn't loan me a dime, but the girl who barely made rent was betting her life on me. October 2021 brought the first frost. My internal clock, forged by years of waking up in cold tents, snapped me awake at 4:30 a.m. I didn't need an alarm. I just felt the change in the air, the way the moisture turned to glass on the window pane. I threw on a heavy coat and grabbed my flashlight. Out in the field, the 200 starter plants were shivering in the dark. I spent 3 hours on my knees in the frozen mud, checking every single root, adjusting the mulch, making sure the ice hadn't choked the life out of them. When Brennan arrived at dawn, she found me covered in gray frost and black mud. She walked the rows, counting. 98.5% survival rate, she noted, her voice showing a rare spark of respect. She looked at me, her eyes lingering on my dirt-stained face. You have the kind of ruthlessness it takes to actually own something, Sonia. It was the first time in 30 years anyone had called my stubbornness a virtue. Then came Thanksgiving. The George family home smelled of roasted turkey, expensive butter, and the kind of cranberry sauce that comes out of a crystal bowl, not a tin can. The heat was set to a perfect 72 degrees. I sat at the far end of the mahogany table, my back aching from 12 hours in the field. Garrett was leaning back in his chair, his face flushed with wine and unearned confidence. He was holding court, talking about how he'd quit his firm to go all in on something called Luna. It's the future, Dad, Garrett bragged, waving a fork around. Real work is for people who don't understand math. I'm going to double my money by Christmas. Douglas nodded, looking at Garrett like he was a god. He didn't ask how Garrett would pay his mortgage without a salary. He just poured more wine. I kept my hands under the table, hidden beneath the white linen cloth. My fingernails were stained with earth that wouldn't scrub off, and my knuckles were cracked and bleeding from the cold. I felt like an alien in a room full of people who had never felt the weight of a shovel. Douglas finally glanced my way, his chin lifting just an inch. How's that dirt of yours? Still alive, I said. Good for you, he muttered, already turning back to Garrett. The conversation had lasted 5 seconds. I was a footnote in my own family's holiday. I left before the pie was served. When I got into my old pickup truck, the engine groaned before catching. The heater blew nothing but cold air through the cracks in the dash. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw the warm golden glow of the living room window. I could see Garrett laughing, my mother pouring coffee, and my father leaning into the light. It was a picture of a life I had helped pay for, but was never allowed to live. I gripped the steering wheel so hard the plastic creaked. Then, the wall I had built around my heart finally gave way. I leaned my head against the cold leather and let out a sound I didn't recognize. I sobbed until my chest hurt, the tears hot and angry against my freezing skin. I cried for the girl who sent her paychecks to people who didn't know her name. I cried for the hands that would never be soft again. By the time I reached my dark, quiet farm, the tears had dried into white salt on my cheeks. I wiped them away with a dirty sleeve and looked out at my field. The lavender was sleeping under the frost. The George family was celebrating their golden boy's imaginary fortune. They didn't realize that while they were eating turkey, I was learning how to survive a winter they wouldn't see coming. March 2022. The smell of lavender oil was so thick it felt like I was breathing in liquid purple. It clung to the pores of my skin, hidden under the scent of sweat and the stale grease of the pickup truck. I was sitting on a rusted metal stool in the barn, tying bundles of dried stalks with twine. My movements were rhythmic. Wrap, pull, knot, repeat. It was a chore that demanded nothing but my time and the strength in my aching fingers. My phone vibrated against the wooden bench. The screen was a spider web of cracks from a drop onto the gravel driveway 3 months ago. Garrett's name flashed. I didn't want to answer, but I knew his type. If I didn't pick up, he'd just keep buzzing until the battery died. What? I said, not bothering with a greeting. The background was a wall of thumping bass and the screech of people laughing too loud. A club, somewhere in the city where the drinks cost more than a bag of fertilizer. Garrett's voice came through, wet and arrogant. Hey, kiddo, listen, I'm doing you a massive favor, he shouted over the music. Dad says you're still up there, literally playing in the mud. It's pathetic. I've got a guy, big player. He needs space for a crypto mining warehouse, high-speed cooling, the whole setup. I talked him into giving you $250,000 for that dirt. Cash. You take the check, get a real job in an office, and stop embarrassing the family. I looked at the bundle in my hand. The buds were tight and fragrant. I thought about the 4:30 a.m. wake-ups. I thought about the frost. The land isn't for sale, Garrett, I said. My voice was a flat line. Sonia, don't be a moron. You're failing. Everyone knows it, he snapped, the playfulness vanishing into that familiar George family condescension. You're a 30-year-old woman with dirt under her nails. Take the money before the bank takes the gate. I didn't argue. I just hit the red button. Silence returned to the barn, save for the low, distant hum of the heater. Summer 2022 was a brutal teacher. The first real harvest came in. I spent 73 hours a week in those rows, my back bent until it felt like it would never straighten again. I lived on black coffee and grit. When I finally ran the numbers on the kitchen table, the math was a punch to the gut. A net loss of $520. I had secured 12 wholesale orders, enough to prove the concept, but not enough to pay the bills. I sat there staring at my banking app. It was a graveyard of small numbers. I thought back to 4 years ago. I remembered the $10,000 re-enlistment bonus I'd received. I had walked into my mother's house and handed her the check, thinking it was a contribution to our collective future. She'd smiled, kissed my cheek, and tucked it into her savings. I never saw a dime of it again. Not when I needed the water heater fixed. Not when the taxes were due. Vivian knew I was struggling. I'd posted a photo on my business page. Just a shot of my hands, raw and covered in weeping blisters from the harvest. She'd seen the story. Her little circle icon appeared in the viewers list. But there was no message. No like. Not even a, be careful. I felt something cold harden inside my chest. I opened my drawer and pulled out a silver credit card. It was a trap, and I knew it. 22.9% interest. A weight that could drown a person. I didn't hesitate. I swiped it for $8,500. I bought more starters. I bought better irrigation. I expanded to 7.2 acres. I was betting everything on a miracle I had to build with my own bones. 2 years of that. 2 years of being a ghost. Garrett had stopped calling after I'd refused his crypto king friend. My parents treated my existence like a mild inconvenience they chose to ignore. Then came June 18th, 2024. The sun was dropping behind the ridge, turning the entire field into a sea of deep, electric purple. The air was buzzing with the sound of thousands of honeybees. It was beautiful, but I was too tired to feel it. I pulled out my phone. My hair was a mess. My t-shirt was stained with grease, and there was a streak of mud across my forehead. I didn't use a filter. I didn't pose. I just held the camera steady for 47 seconds, panned across the blooming rows, and typed 10 words. Sometimes you have to grow your own miracle from scratch. I hit post and went to sleep at 9 p.m. When I woke up, my phone was hot to the touch. The notifications were a blur. 8.3 million views. My inbox was a landslide of orders. People weren't just buying lavender, they were buying the struggle. By the end of the month, the revenue hit $18,950. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just surviving, I was winning. On July 1st, an email landed in my primary folder. Subject, Inquiry regarding Verdant Ventures acquisition. It was from Timothy Schaffer, a vice president. He'd seen the video. He'd seen the brand. He wanted to talk numbers. That same night, the phone started ringing. Garrett. The name flashed on the cracked screen again and again. He called at 8 o'clock, at 8:15, at 8:30. He'd seen the viral hit. He'd smelled the money from 300 miles away. I sat on my porch, the smell of the field wrapping around me like a heavy blanket. I watched the light of the screen fade to black, then flicker back to life with his next attempt. My eyes didn't waver. I didn't feel anger. I felt nothing but the calm, clinical precision of a person who has finally spotted the target. I swiped the notification away, pulled up his contact, and pressed the button. Click. The sound of the block was the quietest, most satisfying thing I'd heard in years. The game wasn't over. It was just finally being played on my grounds. July 2nd, 2024. The George family home smelled like lemon-scented floor wax and expensive cedar. It was my father's birthday, the one day of the year I forced myself to walk through that heavy oak front door. I wasn't wearing my work clothes. I had on a clean pair of jeans and a plain black t-shirt. My work boots were clean, but they still felt heavy on the plush white carpet. I didn't make a sound as I moved. It was an old habit. My weight stayed on the balls of my feet. My eyes swept the entry hall, noting the new landscape painting on the wall and the expensive umbrella stand that cost more than my first irrigation pump. I made it halfway to the kitchen when I heard the sound of ice hitting glass. Clink, clink. It came from behind the drywall of the breakfast nook. Then came the sobbing. It wasn't the loud, messy kind. It was the sharp, jagged breathing of my mother, Vivian. I stopped. I didn't breathe. I pressed my shoulder against the wall, fading into the shadows of the hallway. "You have to do something, Douglas." Vivian's voice was a ragged whisper. "They're calling the house. They're calling the office. Garrett is terrified. He hasn't slept in 3 days." I heard my father sigh, the sound of a man who was tired of being a king. "How much, Vivian? Give me the real number." $890,000, she choked out. The crypto market turned into a graveyard overnight. Luna went to zero. Garrett tried to trade his way out of the hole using money that wasn't his. He went to those people, Douglas, the ones who charge 18% interest every single month. They gave him until the 15th of August. If he doesn't have the cash by then, he's a dead man. The ice rattled again in the glass. My father didn't speak for a long time. The silence in the house was heavy, like the air before a summer storm. "I don't have nearly $1 million in liquid cash, Vivian," Douglas said, his voice flat. "The business is tied up in equipment and payroll." "Then take the farm back," Vivian snapped. Her voice lost the sobbing edge and turned into something cold and sharp. "The land you gave Sonia. It's worth millions now. Everyone is talking about it. That viral video? It put a target on that property. Make her hand it over. Tell her it was always a family asset. Sell it and save Garrett. He's your son, Douglas. He's the one who carries your name. Sonia is just a girl playing in the dirt. She can go find a job at a desk. She doesn't need a legacy." I stood behind that wall, my heart hitting my ribs like a hammer. 10 years ago, she'd used that same voice. She had looked me in the eyes and told me Garrett needed the college fund more than I did. She had told me I was tough and could handle the military, while Garrett was delicate and needed a head start. I had believed her then. I had handed over my future so my brother could buy his. Not this time. I didn't storm into the kitchen. I didn't scream about the blisters on my hands or the nights I spent shivering in the dark. I simply turned around and walked back out the front door. I got into my truck, pulled my phone from my pocket, and sent a text to Amanda Cortez, the most expensive lawyer in the county. Start the sale. Right now. The next morning, I was sitting in a glass-walled office in the city. The air conditioning was humming at a steady 68 degrees. Timothy Schaffer, the vice president of Verdant Ventures, sat across from me. He pushed a folder across the polished black table. $2.4 million, Sonia, he said, his voice smooth and professional. "That's our final offer for the brand and the land." I didn't look at the folder. I looked at him. My right index finger began to tap a steady, slow rhythm on the table. 1, 2, 3. The exact count of a magazine. I didn't blink. $2.85 million, I said. My voice was a dead calm. "I stay on as CEO for 2 years. My salary is $185,000 a year. I keep 3% of the net equity. This isn't a conversation, Timothy. It's a price tag. Take it, or I take my lavender and my 8 million followers to your biggest competitor." Timothy leaned back. He looked at me for a long time, trying to find a crack in the armor. He didn't find one. Regular people always blink first when they're staring at someone who has survived a winter on $18. He grabbed his pen and nodded. On July 8th, I returned to that office. There was a stack of paper on the desk, 47 pages that would change the rest of my life. I picked up a pen with blue ink. My hand didn't shake. I signed my name at the bottom of the last page, the ink biting deep into the heavy paper. Sonia George. Legally, the land was no longer mine. It belonged to a billion-dollar corporation. My parents couldn't sue me for it. They couldn't shame me into giving it up. They couldn't touch it. But on paper, I was still the boss. I held the keys, the payroll, and the power. I walked out of the building and into the bright July sun. I felt a strange, cold peace. The trap was set. The safety was off. I checked my phone and saw a notification from my property's camera system. A silver Mercedes was turning onto the dirt road leading to the farm. Vivian was coming. She was coming to collect a debt she thought I owed her. She had no idea she was driving into a storm she couldn't survive. I got into my truck and started the engine. It was time to go home and finish this. July 11th, 2024. The heat was a heavy, wet blanket over the Hudson Valley. The air didn't move. Even the bees seemed tired. I was out near the barn, checking the irrigation lines, when I heard the sound. It wasn't the rumble of a truck. It was the high-end, muffled purr of a Mercedes-Benz engine. I didn't have to look up to know who it was. The tires crunched on the gravel driveway, a sharp, grinding noise that felt like teeth on bone. The silver car stopped right next to the rusted water barrel. The door opened, and Vivian stepped out. She looked like she belonged in a jewelry commercial, not a farm. Her white linen suit was crisp. Her hair was perfect. She didn't take off her oversized sunglasses. She didn't have to. I could feel the coldness behind them. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't look at the fields of purple that had finally started to pay off. She just stood there, looking at me with a thin, tight line for a mouth. "You have 72 hours, Sonia," she said. Her voice was flat, like she was reading a grocery list. 72 hours to pack your things and hand over the keys. Garrett is coming up on the 14th to take over. He's already found a buyer. We need the money to clear his debts before things get ugly. I stood my ground. My back was straight. My hands were at my sides, covered in the gray dust of the farm. I didn't say a word. I just watched her. Vivian reached into her designer purse and pulled out a slip of paper. She walked over and slapped it onto the top of the rusted barrel. It fluttered for a second before the heat pinned it down. $50,000, she said, her voice dripping with a fake kind of pity. Consider it a buyout for your time here. Garrett is 35. He can't start over with nothing. He's a man. He has a reputation to keep. You're only 30. You're smart. You can go back to the city and find a real job. You don't need to be out here, Sonia. It's not a life for a woman. I looked at that check. $50,000. It was the exact amount, down to the cent. It was the total of every hazard paycheck I had sent home during my 4 years away. Every dollar I had earned sleeping in the cold and eating dirt had been sitting in her account, and now she was trying to use my own blood to buy my silence. She was trying to pay me off with the money I had given her to keep the family afloat. 72 hours, she repeated. Don't make this harder than it has to be. She got back into the Mercedes, the door shut with a heavy, expensive thud. I watched the dust cloud follow her back down the road until she was gone. I didn't pick up the check. I let the wind deal with it. The next morning, July 12th, I was sitting at the kitchen table. The sun hadn't come up yet. The only light in the house was the cold blue glare of my laptop screen. I was drinking black coffee, the kind that burns your throat. I opened my inbox and saw a forwarded message from Vivian. She had probably meant to send it to my father, or maybe she wanted me to see it. It was a thread from Garrett. I read his words, and for a second the air left the room. Mom, can you just make her give it up? She's just playing in the dirt anyway. It's not like she's doing real work. She's 30 years old, for God's sake. Tell her to grow up and get a real job. Dad is on board. Just get her out of there so I can settle this. Playing in the dirt. 7 years of my life. 4 in the service, 3 in these fields. Every blister, every debt, every night I spent crying on the floor of this kitchen because I didn't have enough to pay the heat. To them, it was a hobby. It was a girl playing in the mud until the men were ready to take the prize. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I felt a cold, sharp click in my head. The same feeling I used to get when I had to organize a shipment of heavy equipment in the middle of a storm. When the enemy shows you exactly where they are, you don't cry. You call in the heavy hitters. I took a screenshot of the email. I sent it to Amanda, my lawyer. Change the plan, I typed. My fingers were steady on the keys. Move the merger announcement. I want the press, the bank reps, and the local officials here at noon on July 14th, exactly when my mother's deadline hits. If they want to see me play in the dirt, I'm going to give them a front row seat. I spent the next 48 hours in a blur of motion. I didn't sleep. I didn't eat much. I stayed in the barn, working the phone. I made a list. 43 names, local reporters, business editors from the city, the deputy mayor. Everyone who had ever doubted that a woman could run a commercial farm in this valley. I ordered a vinyl banner, 8 feet wide. I had it delivered by a courier at midnight. I hid it under a tarp in the shed. The George family thought I was packing my bags in tears. They thought they had won. They thought they were the ones holding the cards. They had no idea I had already flipped the table. I'm sitting here in the dark, watching the sun start to peek over the ridge. I can hear the clock on the wall ticking. My own mother offered me crumbs for my own sweat. My brother thinks I'm a joke. Have you ever had a sibling treat you like a footnote? Have you ever had your parents try to steal your future to save a golden child? Comment, not a joke, if you've been there. Hit that like button and subscribe right now. I need you with me because at noon today, the George family's going to find out what happens when you push a woman with nothing left to lose. At 11:45 a.m. on July 14th, I saw the first truck. It wasn't the press, it was Garrett. He pulled his pickup right onto the grass, jumping out with a stack of empty cardboard boxes. He had a smug grin on his face. "Time's up, sis," he yelled, heading for the front door. "Hope you're packed." I stood on the porch, my arms crossed. I looked at my watch. 3 minutes to go. The road behind him was already starting to fill with black SUVs. The party was about to start, 9 a.m. The kitchen was silent, except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the rhythmic drip of the faucet I still hadn't found time to fix. I sat at the table, a mug of black coffee between my hands. It was bitter, burnt, and exactly what I needed. Across from me, Amanda was flipping through a thick stack of papers. She didn't look like a local lawyer today. She looked like a shark in a pinstripe suit. She reached out and adjusted the small lapel mic clipped to my collar, then tapped her tablet. "The Verdant team is at the bottom of the hill," she said, her voice low and steady. 6 SUVs. They've got the local press from the Valley Record and 2 writers from the city. Everything is signed. We're just waiting for the clock. I looked at my watch. 3 hours. 3 hours until the 72-hour deadline my mother had thrown at me like a scrap of garbage would hit 0. I stood up, my movements slow and deliberate. I walked to the sink and poured the rest of the coffee down the drain. I didn't feel shaky. I didn't feel the old hollow ache in my chest. I felt like a clockwork engine, cold, oiled, and ready to turn. 10:30 a.m. I stood in front of the cracked mirror in the hallway. I wasn't wearing my work flannels or the boots caked in Hudson mud. I was wearing a navy blue J. Crew suit. I'd bought it 5 years ago at a clearance rack with the last $50 I'd left after my discharge pay ran dry. I remembered the day I brought it home. Vivian had looked at the stitching, let out a short, sharp laugh, and told me it looked cheap. She told me I'd never get a real job in the city looking like a discount secretary. I pulled the blazer tight. It was a little snug in the shoulders now. 3 years of hauling irrigation pipes had changed my frame, but it held me straight. I reached into a small velvet box on the dresser and pulled out my veteran's pin. It was a tiny piece of metal, but it felt heavier than a lead weight as I slid the needle through the lapel. I didn't need makeup. I didn't need to hide the lines around my eyes or the small scar on my chin. I pulled my hair back into a bun so tight it felt like it was pulling my skin back. I wasn't the girl who sent her paychecks home anymore. I wasn't the daughter they could move around like a piece on a board. I was the CEO of a multi-million-dollar brand, and I was about to show them exactly what my cheap suit was capable of. 11:45 a.m. The sound started. It wasn't the usual quiet of the farm. It was the heavy, crunching grind of high-end tires on the gravel road. One by one, 6 black SUVs rolled onto the grass, parking in a perfect straight line near the barn. Men and women in suits stepped out, holding clipboards and cameras. Timothy Schaffer was in the lead, adjusting his tie as he looked over the purple rows. He looked at me and gave a short, professional nod. Behind the crowd, 2 men from the event team were adjusting a massive black tarp. It was draped over an 8-foot vinyl sign I'd had installed in the middle of the night. It sat right at the edge of the driveway, a dark, silent secret waiting for the sun to hit it. I stood on the porch, my hands clasped behind my back. I watched the reporters set up their tripods. I watched the bank reps from the city check their watches. The air was thick with the smell of lavender and the ozone of an approaching storm. 11:52 a.m. A familiar roar echoed from the trees. It was the sound of a truck being driven by someone who didn't care about the transmission. Garrett's pickup truck swung around the corner, fishtailing slightly as he slammed it into park right in front of the gate. He jumped out before the engine had even stopped rattling. He was wearing a grease-stained t-shirt and jeans, his face flushed with a mixture of sweat and unearned victory. He didn't even notice the SUVs at first. He reached into the back of the truck and grabbed 3 empty cardboard boxes, shoving them into a stack. "Time's up, Sonia," he yelled, his voice cracking with a manic sort of glee. He started marching toward the porch, kicking a clod of dirt out of his way. "I told you I was coming at noon. I've got the buyer coming by at 2. If your crap isn't out of the house, I'm throwing it into the bonfire. Mom and Dad are right behind me. We're done playing games with your little garden." He made it halfway to the porch before he stopped. His boots skidded on the gravel. He finally looked past me. He saw the cameras. He saw the black SUVs. He saw the 40 people in tailored suits looking at him like he was a stray dog that had wandered into a boardroom. His jaw dropped, the empty boxes slipping from his grip and tumbling onto the grass. Right then, the silver Mercedes turned the corner. It moved slowly, with the same arrogant grace Vivian always used. It pulled up behind Garrett's truck, the sun glinting off the polished chrome. Douglas was driving, his face set in a grim, dutiful mask. Vivian sat in the passenger seat, her chin high, her oversized sunglasses masking her eyes. She stepped out of the car, smoothing her skirt, a trumpery smile already forming on her lips. The smile of a mother coming to clean up her daughter's mess. She looked at Garrett, then followed his gaze to the crowd on the lawn. I watched the smile die. I watched her face go pale, then turn a mottled, ugly gray. Her hand went to her throat, her fingers fumbling with her pearls. She looked at the reporters, then at Timothy, then finally at me. I didn't move. I didn't smile. I just looked down at her from the porch, my back like a rod of iron. "You're early," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but in the sudden silence of the farm, it carried like a shot. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a remote. I looked Garrett right in the eyes of the boy who thought I was just playing in the dirt. Then I pressed the button. The black tarp began to slide. High noon. The sun was a white-hot coin in the center of the sky, baking the scent of lavender and dry gravel into a thick, perfumed haze. The air didn't move. The only sound was the rhythmic, metallic click, click, click of the photographers from the city papers. I stood on the edge of the porch, my back like a rod of iron, watching the world I'd built collide with the family that had tried to bury me. I looked down at my watch. 12 p.m. I caught Amanda's eye. She was standing by the podium, her hand resting on a stack of legal folders that felt like a death sentence for the George family's greed. I gave her a short, sharp nod. It was the only signal needed. 2 men in black polo shirts stepped forward. They weren't police, but they were big, and they moved with the quiet authority of people paid to handle problems. They grabbed the edges of the black tarp. With one coordinated tug, the heavy vinyl slid down. The sign underneath was 8 feet wide. It was white with bold, black block letters that caught the glare of the sun. New ownership, Verdant Ventures, LLC. Garrett let out a sound, a choked, ugly gasp. He took a step forward, his empty cardboard boxes still clutched in his arms like a shield. He opened his mouth, his face turning a deep, bruised purple. He looked like he wanted to scream, to curse me out, to tell me to get off his land. But he didn't get the chance. One of the security men stepped into his path, a solid wall of muscle that didn't budge an inch. Garrett stumbled back, his boots slipping on the loose gravel. The empty boxes fell to the grass, rolling away in the dirt. Amanda stepped up to the microphone. The feedback hummed for a split second before her voice cut through the heat, cold and professional. 3 years ago, she began, her eyes scanning the reporters, Sonia George took possession of a property that was publicly valued at $0. It was described by its previous owners as bad soil and a collapsing house. Today, after 3 years of independent operation and significant brand growth, Verdant Ventures is proud to announce the official acquisition of this farm and the Sonia's secret brand. She paused, letting the silence hang. The finalized valuation for this acquisition is $2.85 million. The crowd erupted. A wave of murmurs and the sudden, frantic scratching of pens on notebooks filled the air. I looked at my mother. Vivian was leaning against the silver Mercedes, her hand clamped over her mouth. Her face was ashen, the color of old newspaper. She looked like she was choking on the very air she breathed. Beside her, Douglas was staring at the sign, his jaw hanging open, his eyes glassy and vacant. They had come here to evict a girl they thought was broke and broken. Instead, they were standing on the lawn of a multi-million-dollar corporation. A reporter from the Valley Record shoved a microphone toward me. "Ms. George, Sonia, $2.8 million. That's a life-changing amount of money. What's the first thing a woman like you does with that kind of capital?" I didn't look at the reporter. I looked straight at Vivian. I looked at the oversized sunglasses that hid her shame. I thought about the 38-degree nights. I thought about the $50,000 check she'd tried to use to buy my soul. "I'm going to use it to expand," I said. My voice was steady, projecting over the crowd without effort. "I'm going to invest in the next woman who is handed a pile of dirt and told she's just playing. I'm going to make sure that when someone tells her she doesn't need a legacy because she's only a woman, she has the resources to prove them wrong." Vivian flinched as if I'd reached out and slapped her across the mouth. Timothy Schaffer stepped forward, holding a leather-bound contract. He looked at the crowd, then at me. "As part of the merger, Sonia George will remain as the chief executive officer for the next 2 years, with a base salary of $185,000 and a 3% equity stake in the parent company." Garrett was shaking now. I could smell the panic coming off him, a sour, acidic scent that cut through the lavender. He was realizing that the land was gone. The crypto warehouse was a dream that had just died in the dirt. He was looking at nearly $1 million in debt to people who didn't take no for an answer. And the only person who could save him was the sister he'd called a failure. I reached into the inner pocket of my navy blazer. I pulled out a pen. It was a cheap, blue plastic ballpoint, the kind you buy in a 10-pack at a gas station. The cap was chewed and the ink was low. It was the same pen I had used to write dozens of letters from a desert barracks. Letters to my mother, letters to my father, letters that were never answered because they were too busy spending my hazard pay. I walked to the podium. I didn't look at the photographers. I didn't look at Timothy. I looked at the signature line on the final page. I pressed the tip of that $12 pen into the paper. The ink felt heavy, biting into the fiber. I signed my name with a single, sharp stroke. Sonia George. The applause broke out again, but it sounded distant, like thunder on the other side of the ridge. I put the pen back in my pocket. It was done. The farm was a fortress now. Timothy began to lead the press toward the barn for the reception. The SUVs started to pull away, one by one, leaving behind nothing but the smell of exhaust and success. The reporters followed the money. The bank reps followed the wine. Within 20 minutes, the lawn was empty. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was the silence after a storm. I stood on the porch and looked at the three of them. Garrett was sitting on the ground next to his empty boxes, his head in his hands. Douglas was leaning on the car, looking like an old man who had finally realized he was lost. Vivian was still standing there, her pearls tight against her throat. I walked down the steps. My boots crunched on the gravel, the sound loud and final. I didn't stop until I was 3 feet away from them. I didn't say a word. I just tilted my head toward the front door. "Inside," I said. It wasn't a request. "We have things to settle." I turned my back on them and walked toward the house. I heard the heavy clang of the front gate as Amanda closed it behind the last guest. The George family was alone now, and for the first time in 30 years, I was the one holding the keys. The heavy iron gate at the end of the driveway clanged shut, the sound echoing off the hills like a final gunshot. The press was gone. The black SUVs were nothing but fading dust trails on the horizon. Inside the house, the silence was heavy, smelling of old dust and the bitter, burnt dregs of my morning coffee. I stood by the kitchen counter, my back straight, my hands resting flat on the formica surface. I didn't look at them. I just listened to the sound of 3 pairs of lungs struggling to breathe in a room where the air had just run out. Garrett was the first to snap. He didn't just speak, he exploded. He swung his arm, his fist slamming into the scratched wooden dining table with a dull, hollow thud. "You think you're so smart, don't you?" he hissed, his voice cracking, high-pitched and ugly. "You set us up. You sold out the family legacy to some city corporate suits just to spit in our faces. Do you have any idea what you've done? I needed that land, Sonia. I had people, real people, counting on that deal. I'm deep in the hole, and you just signed my death warrant for a headline. Where is the loyalty? Where is the heart? You're a traitor to your own blood." I finally turned my head. I looked at him, not as my brother, but as a failed inventory report. His face was a mottled, sweaty red. His eyes were wide and wet with the kind of fear that only comes to men who have spent their whole lives spending money they didn't earn. "Loyalty?" I said. My voice was a low, steady hum, devoid of any heat. "You've got the nerve to talk about heart while you're standing in a house you haven't put a single dollar into since I bought the paint. You didn't make a mistake, Garrett. Quitting your job because you thought you were a tech genius was a decision. Putting the house you lived in on a digital gambling screen was a decision. Borrowing money from sharks at 18% interest was a decision. I didn't sign your warrant. You did. I just stopped paying for the ink." Vivian let out a sharp, choked sob, her hand clutching the pearls at her neck so hard the string looked like it might snap. She sank into the worn armchair, the one with the frayed arms. She looked small. She looked like a cheap imitation of the woman who had stood on this porch 72 hours ago and tried to buy my soul for 50 grand. "How can you be so cold?" she whined, her voice thin and shaking. "I gave you this land, Sonia. I brought you here. I wanted you to have something of your own. And this is how you thank me. By humiliating us in front of the whole county? We're your parents. We're the only people who will ever truly care about you. Give us the money. Give Garrett what he needs to clear the debt, and we can forget this ever happened. We can be a family again." I walked over to the chair. I didn't lean down. I stood over her, my shadow stretching across her polished shoes. "You didn't give me land, Mom. You gave me a tax bill and a pile of rotting wood because you thought I was too stupid to see it was a trap. You wanted me to fail so you could feel better about dumping everything into him. You remember that night in June? The night it hit 38 degrees? I had $192 in my bank account because I'd spent every cent I had to keep the lights on here. I had to take a cold shower in the dark because the heater was blown and I couldn't afford the fix. While I was shivering until my teeth chipped, you were giving Garrett $15,000 for a leather sofa so he could sit in the AC and watch his crypto numbers fall. You didn't care then. Don't you dare pretend to care now." Douglas was standing by the window, his back to the room. He hadn't said a word. But as I spoke, I saw his shoulders sag. He looked older than 70. He looked like a man who had built his house on sand and was finally feeling the tide come in. He turned around slowly, his jaw working, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. I thought he was the investment," Douglas muttered, his voice barely a whisper. I thought you'd just find a way. You always did. You were the tough one. I didn't think it would come to this. I was tough because I had to be, I snapped, the first spark of anger finally breaking through my ice. I was the investment too, Dad. I sent every hazard check home for 4 years. I paid for that silver Mercedes in the driveway. I paid for Garrett's luxury apartment for 2 years while I was sleeping in a hole in the ground. You didn't evaluate me. You ignored me. And that was your biggest failure as a businessman. Douglas looked down at his hands, his knuckles trembling. I was wrong, he whispered. Sonia, I was wrong. It was too little. It was 3 decades too late. I walked to the front door and pulled it wide. The afternoon sun poured into the hallway, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the air. I pointed to the driveway. The party is over, I said. My voice was a steel door closing. Tomorrow morning, the debt collectors are going to realize the land is gone. They're going to come to your house. They're going to come for your cars. You have 15 hours to figure out how you're going to survive. But you're not doing it on my dime. Not ever again. Garrett lunged forward as if he wanted to grab my blazer, but I didn't move. I just looked at him with the cold, flat stare of a person who had seen much worse than him. He stopped, his chest heaving, his face crumbling into a mask of pure, pathetic defeat. They shuffled out one by one. Douglas went first, his head down. Vivian followed, her face hidden behind her sunglasses, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Garrett was last, trailing behind like a kicked dog, his hands empty, his future a black hole. I watched them get into the car. I watched the silver Mercedes back out of my gate for the last time. I stepped back inside and gripped the heavy brass handle of the front door. I pulled it shut. Clack. The sound of the deadbolt sliding into place was the most beautiful thing I'd ever heard. I leaned my head against the wood and took a long, deep breath of air that finally, for the first time in 30 years, belonged entirely to me. January 2025. The Hudson Valley was a world of white and gray. A thick blanket of snow covered the fields, smoothing out the jagged edges of the earth until everything looked soft and silent. The wind rattled the window panes of the farmhouse, but the cold didn't get in. Inside, the central heating hummed with a low, expensive purr, maintaining a steady 68 degrees. I stood by the large bay window in the living room, holding a mug of chamomile tea. The steam rose in a slow, lazy spiral, smelling of dried flowers and honey. It was a quiet kind of peace. The kind of peace you only get when you finally stop waiting for someone else to tell you it's okay to be happy. The news from the city had arrived a few days ago in a series of cold, dry updates. 6 months was all it took for the George family's house of cards to finally catch fire. Garrett was officially bankrupt. The bank had moved in on his glass-walled condo in November, dragging his designer furniture out onto the sidewalk while he watched from the curb. He had tried to spin it as a strategic pivot, but the city papers didn't care. To them, he was just another over-leveraged kid who had bet his life on a digital coin that didn't exist. He had crawled back to the family home, moving into his childhood bedroom with 2 suitcases of clothes he couldn't afford to dry clean. He was working a retail job at a high-end electronics store now. $52,000 a year. He spent 40 hours a week explaining laptop specs to people who had more money than he would ever see again. The golden boy was now just another man in a polyester vest, punching a clock. My father, Douglas, was fading too. The diagnosis had come in late October. Parkinson's. It was early, but the tremors were already there, a constant rattling reminder that his grip on the world was slipping. They were living on a fixed income now, their savings bled dry by Garrett's bailouts and the high-interest loans they had signed to keep the bill collectors away. Yesterday, a thick manila envelope had appeared in my mailbox. I sat on the sofa, the leather cool against my skin, and opened it. Inside were 3 pages of yellow legal paper, covered in the shaky, jagged handwriting of a man who knew he was running out of time. Douglas had spent 3 pages begging for a bridge. He apologized for the bias. He apologized for the dirt comment. He wrote about how he'd realized I was the only one with the steel to keep the George name alive. He asked if I could find it in myself to come home for Sunday dinner. to help them manage the transition. Even Garrett had sent a message, a single text from a burner number. I took it all for granted. I know that now. Don't let Mom lose the house. I read every word. I looked at the way the ink smeared where his hand had shaken. I looked at the desperation between the lines. Then I stood up and walked to the hearth. The wood fire was crackling, throwing orange light against the walls. I didn't feel a surge of triumph. I didn't feel a spark of anger. I felt a profound, hollow nothing. I folded the papers once, then twice. I tossed them into the center of the flames. I watched the edges curl, turning black and brittle before the fire swallowed them whole. I didn't reply. I didn't pick up the phone to yell or cry. I simply leaned back against the mantel and watched the paper turn to gray ash. I didn't hate them anymore. I just didn't care. Forgiveness is a gift for people who still have a place in your life. The George family had become strangers to me a long time ago. I was just finally acknowledging the distance. I turned back to the window. Outside, under that deep, heavy snow, 4,100 lavender roots were sleeping. They weren't just plants anymore. They were a corporate asset. 2 weeks ago, I had signed the final supply contract with Whole Foods for the Northeast region, a $1.2 million deal. The first shipments would go out in May. The brand was no longer a secret. It was a staple. I thought back to that night in June, the night I'd huddled under a thin blanket, counting pennies and praying the water heater wouldn't blow. I remembered the way the cold felt like a physical weight, pressing me into the floor. Now, I looked at the digital thermostat on the wall. 68 degrees. I adjusted the collar of my sweater. The scar on my chin was a faint, white line in the reflection of the glass. It was part of the landscape now. A mark of where I'd been, but not a definition of where I was going. I picked up my phone. I took a photo of the field, just a vast, unbroken expanse of white snow under a pale blue winter sky. No people, no drama, just the land. I opened the brand's social media page and posted the image. I didn't need a long caption. I didn't need to explain myself to the millions of people watching. I just typed the words that had become my own personal law. They tell you, blood is a bond you can't break. They're wrong. You don't owe your success to the people who tried to steal your light. You only owe it to the version of yourself that stayed awake in the dark. I hit post and set the phone face down on the table. The sun was starting to set, casting long purple shadows across the snow. It was beautiful. It was mine. I took a slow sip of the tea, feeling the warmth spread through my chest. The house was quiet. The empire was safe. The story was over, and for the first time in my life, I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Alone, free, and completely, untouchably whole.